The last broadcast. Jesse Grant sat at his desk in the control room of WKRB, the small-town radio station he had called home for the past 15 years. It was late, too late for most people to be awake, but that was the magic of late-night radio. The world outside was sleeping, but Jesse was awake, spinning the vinyl and spinning stories. His voice was a comfort to the lonely and the restless, the drunks and the insomniacs, the outcasts who found solace in the sound of a familiar voice. It was a quiet night, just the way Jesse liked it. The clock on the wall ticked, a soft reminder of the minutes that bled into hours. He leaned back in his chair, sipping his coffee from the chipped mug that had WKRB Where the Music Lives printed on it in faded letters. He was alone in the control room, the only person awake in the building. The lights above him buzzed quietly, the hum of the machines providing a steady background noise. Then the phone rang. Jesse stared at the old rotary phone, a relic from another time. It was a sound that shouldn't have been heard at this hour. Not in a town where nothing ever happened after midnight. The phone rang again, louder this time, more insistent. With a sigh, Jesse reached over and lifted the receiver. WKRB, you're live with Jesse, he said, trying to sound as casual as possible, as if this were just another call from one of the regulars. But the voice on the other end of the line was unlike any voice he had ever heard. It wasn't the crackly, sleepy drawl of the usual callers. No, this was clear. Too clear. The voice was calm, almost unnervingly so. Jesse Grant, the voice said. You don't know me, but I know you. Jesse sat up straight in his chair, the hairs on the back of his neck standing at attention. He could feel the weight of the silence that followed. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath. I'm listening, he said, trying to mask the unease creeping into his chest. The voice didn't seem to notice his discomfort. In fact, it seemed almost too calm, too composed, as if the person on the other end knew something that Jesse didn't. I'm calling from the future, the voice continued, its tone flat, unemotional. I've been watching you, Jesse, watching this town, and I know what's going to happen here. Jesse's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure whether to laugh or hang up. The future. It was insane. Impossible. You've been drinking too much, Jesse said, forcing a chuckle into his voice. This is a radio station, buddy, not a fortune teller booth. The voice didn't respond to his sarcasm. It simply continued, as if it were reading from a script written in some cold, detached place beyond Jesse's understanding. A woman will die in less than 2 hours, the voice said. Her name is Sarah Richards. You know her. She works at the diner on Main Street. You'll hear about it on the news tomorrow morning, but I'm telling you now, if you don't stop it, she will die. Jesse's fingers gripped the receiver harder. His mind was racing. The woman, Sarah Richards, was a regular at the station. He remembered her, always smiling, always kind. She had 2 kids, a husband who worked at the hardware store. He couldn't imagine what could happen to her, but the cold certainty in the voice on the other end of the line made him hesitate. Stop it, Jesse asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What the hell are you talking about? You can prevent it, the voice said. You just have to know where to be and when. Jesse's pulse quickened. The voice wasn't just talking nonsense. It was speaking as if it knew things. Things about Sarah, things about him, things about the town. And then it said something that made Jesse's stomach drop. You've been the one keeping this town alive, Jesse. You're the only one who can stop it. Before he could respond, the line went dead. Jesse sat there, staring at the receiver in his hand. His mind spun with questions. He had heard all kinds of strange things in his time behind the mic. But this was different. This wasn't some prank. The voice had known things it shouldn't have. He could still hear the coldness in his ears, the lack of emotion in its words. A sense of dread crawled up his spine. It felt real, but it couldn't be. It couldn't be. And yet, there was something about it. Something about the way the voice spoke. So certain, so precise, that made Jesse hesitate. The clock ticked on, mocking him with its relentless pace. He glanced at the studio monitors. The playlist was playing smoothly, the sounds of old rock and roll filling the room, but all he could think about was Sarah Richards and the chilling warning that had just been delivered to him. With trembling hands, he reached for the phone again, dialing the diner. The phone rang several times before someone picked up. "Diner?" A sleepy voice answered. "Is Sarah there?" Jesse asked, trying to keep his voice steady. There was a pause on the other end. "Jesse, it's nearly 2 in the morning thus," the voice said. "Sarah's not here. She left about an hour ago. Why? You need to talk to her?" Jesse felt his heart sink. The voice had been right. Sarah had left the diner an hour ago. "Do you know where she went?" he asked urgently. "Not sure," the voice said. "She said something about heading home to the kids, but that was all." "Why? What's going on?" I don't know," Jesse said, his voice shaking now. "Just keep an eye out. I'll figure this out." He hung up before the voice could ask any more questions. Jesse stood up from his chair and paced around the studio. His mind was racing. How could he stop something that he didn't even understand? How could he stop a death that hadn't happened yet? He couldn't shake the image of Sarah Richards from his mind. The way the voice had spoken of her death, so matter-of-fact, so certain, made it feel inevitable, like it was already written in stone. And yet, the more he thought about it, the more he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. It wasn't just about Sarah. There was something else, something darker. And that's when it hit him. What if the voice wasn't talking about the future? What if it was talking about something else? Something outside time? He glanced at the clock again. He had less than 2 hours to figure this out, to stop a death that hadn't even happened yet. And if he failed, then the voice would be right. Jesse felt his stomach tighten. He was standing at the edge of something he didn't understand, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to know what lay beyond it. Jesse grabbed his coat and keys. He wasn't sure where he was going, but he knew he couldn't just sit there and wait for the inevitable. If there was even a small chance that the voice on the phone had been right, then Sarah Richards' life depended on him. As he stepped outside, The cool night air hit him like a slap. The streets of Blackridge were deserted. The occasional flicker of a neon sign, the only movement. He got into his rusted-out Buick, started the engine, and pulled out onto the empty road. The diner was only a few blocks away, but Jesse didn't bother stopping there. If Sarah had left an hour ago, she'd either be home or somewhere in between. He took a right toward her house, his hands tight on the wheel. His mind was racing. What the hell am I even doing? He wasn't a cop. He wasn't a hero. He was a damn radio DJ. His biggest concern up until an hour ago had been whether or not his audience wanted more Pink Floyd or Led Zeppelin. But something about the voice had gotten into him. The certainty, the way it spoke, like this was already written in stone. Jesse turned onto Maple Street, where Sarah's house was. He scanned the sidewalks, the driveways. Nothing. Then, up ahead, in the dim glow of a single flickering street lamp, he saw her car. It was parked at an odd angle, driver's side door wide open. Jesse's stomach dropped. He slammed the brakes, throwing the Buick into park. "Sarah?" he called, stepping out of the car. His voice felt too loud in the quiet. No answer. He approached the car slowly, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. Inside, the keys were still in the ignition. Sarah's purse was spilled out on the seat. And then he saw the blood. A small smear of it near the handle. His breath came fast and sharp. He turned, scanning the street. Nothing but darkness. Houses with the curtains drawn tight. Then, a sound. A rustling from the trees lining the sidewalk. Jesse took a step closer, his heart hammering. And that's when he saw her. Sarah Richards was standing in the shadows beneath the trees, facing away from him, perfectly still. "Sarah?" Jesse called out again. She didn't move. Something was wrong. Jesse took another step forward. And she turned. His breath hitched in his throat. Her eyes. They were wrong. Wide staring. Unfocused, like she wasn't there. And then, in a slow, mechanical voice, she spoke. "You shouldn't have come, Jesse." His blood ran cold. It wasn't her voice. It was the voice, the one from the phone. Jesse stumbled back. "What? You've already made the first mistake," the voice continued. Its tone calm, eerily emotionless. "And now, you'll make the rest." Sarah took a step toward him. Her movements were wrong, jolted, almost puppet-like. Jesse turned and ran. He didn't know where, just away. He made it back to his car, fumbling with the door handle, throwing himself inside. His hand shook as he jammed the keys into the ignition. In the rearview mirror, he saw Sarah still standing there, watching. Then, the radio crackled. Jesse froze. The static filled the car, growing louder until... "You can't run, Jesse." His stomach turned to ice. The voice was in the radio. And then, his fingers. He hadn't touched the dial, but it was turning, switching stations on its own. Through the static, voices started bleeding through. His voice. "No." Jesse's own voice played back at him, distorted, fragmented. Then another voice, a scream, Sarah's scream. Jesse's breath came in short gasps. He threw the car into gear, tires screeching as he sped away. But the voice followed him, everywhere. The streetlights flickered as he passed. The radio buzzed, filled with whispers, voices from nowhere. And in his head, a realization settled in like a stone in his gut. The voice wasn't from the future. It wasn't a warning. It was making things happen. It had told him Sarah would die. And now? Now she was gone. Jesse swerved onto the main road, gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles went white. "Leave me alone," he screamed at the radio. The static roared, and then laughter, cold, mechanical. "You don't get it, Jesse," the voice said. "You were never supposed to stop anything." The station signal cut out completely. Then silence. Jesse sat there, panting, his pulse roaring in his ears. Then a single phrase crackled through the speakers. "Now, let's talk about what happens next." The road ahead stretched into the darkness. Jesse didn't dare look back. The reflection. Jason Hughes hadn't been the type to believe in ghosts. At least, not in the traditional sense. He had grown up on stories told by his grandmother about the things that lurked in the shadows of their old house. But those were just stories, right? Things you told little kids to get them to behave. He wasn't a little kid anymore. He was 15. It was a Friday afternoon when it all started, when his life veered off the path of normal into something else entirely. Jason had spent the better part of the day slouched in front of his computer, earbuds stuffed in his ears, clicking away at some game that was almost as mindless as the schoolwork that lay waiting for him. He'd avoided it all week, and now there was no getting out of it. His mom had gone to the store, and his little sister was glued to the TV in the living room. So Jason had the house to himself for a bit. He took a quick break. He'd only planned to grab a drink from the fridge. But when he walked by the bathroom, the mirror caught his eye. The bathroom was dim, the ceiling light flickering slightly, casting shadows across the room. Jason had never been a fan of the bathroom mirror. It was one of those old-fashioned ones, heavy with a wooden frame and slightly warped at the edges. His reflection had always looked a little off, but he'd never paid much attention to it before. Today, though, was different. Jason stopped. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way the light hit the glass, or the way his reflection looked a little too still, a little too perfect. He leaned in, staring at his own face. He smirked, making a silly face, sticking out his tongue at the reflection, just to see how it would react. It didn't. Jason blinked, suddenly feeling silly for even checking. But then, something strange happened. His reflection moved. It shifted ever so slightly, like a delay in a video feed, as if it were a half-second behind his own motions. He froze, trying to figure it out. Maybe it was the dim light playing tricks on him, the reflection not quite syncing with his movements. But the reflection didn't mimic him the way it should. The left corner of his lips twitched upward, just a fraction of a second later than his own. But Jason wasn't smiling anymore. He stood perfectly still, his gaze locked on the mirror. There was something wrong with the way his reflection was staring back at him. It wasn't him anymore. Jason felt a chill rush up his spine, a knot tightening in his stomach. It was subtle at first, the way his reflection tilted its head slightly, as if studying him. The real Jason swallowed hard, taking a step back. His reflection didn't follow. His reflection remained where it was, staring back at him, unmoving. A weird laugh escaped Jason's lips, and he shook his head. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe it was the way the shadows were playing tricks on his mind. "Okay, enough of that," he muttered, stepping away from the bathroom door and back down the hallway toward his room. It was all in his head. Hours passed, and Jason had nearly forgotten about the weird thing with the mirror. He was back in his room now, the schoolwork still untouched on his desk. But the incident with the reflection refused to leave him. It lingered in the back of his mind like a song stuck on repeat. At dinner that night, Jason sat with his family, but his mind was elsewhere. He barely listened as his mom talked about the errands she'd run, or his sister's excitement about the upcoming weekend plans. All he could think about was the damn mirror. "I'm going to take a shower," he said, excusing himself. His mom didn't respond. She was deep in a conversation with his sister about their new neighbors. Jason headed down the hallway, his mind reeling with thoughts of the reflection. He could still see it in his mind's eye, the way it had tilted its head, the way it had stared at him. Not like it was copying him, but like it was watching him, waiting. As he stepped into the bathroom, he felt a strange weight in the air, as though something was pressing down on his shoulders. The room was colder than it should have been, but he figured that was just the old house. He took a deep breath, feeling the steam from the shower start to build up in the room. He stood before the mirror, his gaze meeting his reflection again. This time, he made sure to keep his eyes locked on his image. He moved his fingers, letting them hover in front of his face as he adjusted his hair. The reflection did the same, mimicking his every move, but when Jason took a step back, the reflection didn't. It stayed still, staring at him. Jason blinked, a feeling of dread creeping up his spine. The reflection's eyes were different. They seemed darker now, more intense. "This is stupid," he thought, backing away toward the shower. But the reflection didn't move. It was like it was frozen, or worse, like it was studying him. Jason reached for the shower handle and turned it on. The sound of the water filling the space around him was comforting, almost drowning out the sense of panic that had begun to creep up his chest. He tried to shake it off. He had a lot on his mind, and the bathroom was always a little unsettling at night. But that wasn't it. It was something else, something worse. The reflection didn't move. Jason turned his back on the mirror and stepped into the warm spray, the steam quickly fogging up the room. The changes began. By the next day, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. At school, everything was the same dull routine, the same stupid fights between friends. But at the same time, it felt like he was in a fog, like everything was happening just a little too slowly, or maybe too quickly. When he came home, the first thing he did was rush to the bathroom again, determined to prove to himself that the mirror was just a trick of the light. It was a stupid thing to fixate on, but it felt like the only thing that mattered. He stood in front of the mirror again, holding his breath, waiting for the reflection to act out of sync again. He didn't even move at first. He just stared at his own face, watching for any sign of something. Nothing happened at first, but then slowly, his reflection began to move.